Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Sherman. I'm the 2020 president of the Appraisal Institute, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. We do have a lot of valuable information to share with you. Today's topics are designed to bring some guidance to all valuation professionals. I'd like you to note that we presently have limited capacity for live streaming, but that a recorded version of this webinar will be placed on our website very soon after we finish. So if you're talking to other valuation professionals who couldn't get on, that weren't able to take advantage, please let them know that it's available on the section we have for coronavirus on our website. So there are two parts to today's guidance. The first includes information regarding the appraisal process and reports. The second portion will examine client reactions as well as governmental actions and issues. First, there are two technical items. So if we could go to the second slide, please. This will run 90 minutes, and most of our work will be in the first 60. We hope to leave 30 minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions, you'll see a box there to the right in the webinar section, and you can write in a question and we will try to get that to someone to answer for you. Also, if you have any technical issues, the phone number to call for GoToMeeting would be 1-800-263-6317. Again, that's 800-263-6317. Thank everyone for being here. We really have, we're going to start with our USPAP experts, Stephanie Coleman, our Director of Screening and Professional Standards, Director of Screening, as well as Jim Moret, who is the Chair of Professional Standards and Guidance. So Jim and Stephanie, if you'd go ahead, please.
Thank you, President Sherman.
Let me give you control.
As chair of the Institute's Professional Standards and Guidance Committee, along with Stephanie Coleman, the AI's Director of Screening, as President Sherman just mentioned, we are going to focus on how the COVID-19 pandemic needs to be addressed in your appraisal report, highlighting your market analysis and identifying market imperfections. It is important to remember that we are all in this together, and the safety and wellness of you and your family comes first and foremost as we discuss these issues surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. The Appraisal Institute certainly hopes that all are well, and we send our thoughts out to everyone, especially those in the appraisal profession. Anything we say here is trumped by your own individual decisions regarding your personal health and well-being. In speaking to clients, Stephanie and I hear their concerns that appraisers do not expose their clients and tenants to the virus, but we as appraisers must also take caution that we are not exposed by these same individuals. That is why many clients and the government-sponsored enterprises have adjusted their assignment scope of work to allow for alternatives to an interior inspection of the subject property. Bill and Doug will address the GSE policy later in this webinar, but as it pertains to USPAP compliance, really nothing has changed. USPAP has never required a property inspection. However, the appraiser must identify relevant property characteristics to produce a credible opinion of value given the assignment scope of work. An interior inspection by a qualified appraiser is always preferred, and the Appraisal Institute will continue to advocate this position, which we feel is necessary for most assignments. For your reference, the Appraisal Institute has resource material on inspecting in the publications Scope of Work Second Edition, written by my co-presenter Stephanie Coleman, and in the Institute's The Appraisal of Real Estate 14th edition. Both books are available on our website under Publications. Also, in USPAP Standards Rules 1-2E and Advisory Opinion 2, which is inspection of the subject property, provides further guidance. So the most pressing question that Stephanie has received from appraisers is, what should I say in my appraisal reports about the COVID-19 crisis? In addition, some advice that we can give is, be aware of advice that is not accurate. There has been some erroneous advice on various appraiser forum chats, as well as some company/client policy announcements. Stephanie will now take over and address these issues. Stephanie?
Thank you, Jim. And before I begin, I'd like to also extend my well wishes to all of you. This crisis has touched everyone in so many ways, and as appraisers, it's made our work especially challenging. So let's remember how fortunate we are and that we have this wonderful appraisal community. We're in uncharted territory, but we're in it together and we can help each other navigate. So the short answer to the question is yes, you do need to address the COVID-19 crisis in your appraisal report, but not as a limiting condition or a disclaimer or as an assumption or as an extraordinary assumption. So for the long answer, I think we need to revisit some basics, go way back to the basics, and talk about what it is we do as appraisers. I think it's really important to remember that, yes, we provide opinions of value. That's the definition of an appraisal, an opinion of value. But value is by definition inherently an opinion. So really what we do as appraisers is we provide opinions of what a property is worth. It's not what we think the value is that matters. What matters is what the market thinks the value is. So we're one step removed, so to speak, and this might give you a level of comfort. What this means, though, is that we have to be keen observers of the market. Careful market analysis is critical, always in any appraisal, but even more so in times like these. So more on how we accomplish market analysis in a time like this in just a minute. I want to revisit another basic first. Let's talk a little bit about how we derive opinions of value. We apply the valuation process or the appraisal framework, and that's an economic model. It's based on economic theory. I like to use a tent as an analogy. If you're a camper, you'll know exactly what I mean. And if not, you can probably remember back to when you were a little kid and you made a tent in the backyard using 2 sticks, an old sheet, and some rope. But either way, when you pitch a tent, you have in your mind the idea of what a tent should be. It's going to have a flat bottom. It's going to be on soft ground, free of rocks and tree roots, and each stake is going to slide easily into the ground to exactly the same depth. And your tent will be perfectly upright and symmetrical. Of course, it's never that way in reality. No matter, though, as long as it keeps you dry, keeps the bugs out, and doesn't blow away, it's a reliable tent. So applying the appraisal framework is a lot like pitching a tent. The objective of most appraisals is to come up with market value. And while there are different definitions of market value, they all presume pretty much the same condition. You know, willing buyer and seller, acting in their own best interest, in essence, knowledgeable and rational market participants. But these conditions rarely exist, even in quote unquote normal times. So just like all economic models, the appraisal model is imperfect, but that's not because what appraisers do is imperfect, it's because the market is imperfect. We don't have level, rock-free ground on which to pitch our tent. Sometimes it's on a sloping ground, it's on rocks, on the side of a cliff in a windstorm, but we pitch the tent anyway. We apply the appraisal model anyway. We acknowledge that buyers and sellers aren't always well informed. They don't always act rationally. And especially in times like these, it's difficult to make sense of what they're doing. So in our market analysis, this is the observation we make. We aren't the ones, as appraisers, we aren't the ones who are confused or lacking knowledge. We know very well what we see, a confused and maybe even panicked market. There's no uncertainty about that. We aren't assuming anything. This is the observation we make. Another important point is that all values reflect market participants' anticipations or expectations regarding future benefits. Something has value today only because of what it will bring in the future from this day forward. But appraisers aren't expected to have a crystal ball. Oops, and I went ahead a little bit too fast there on my slides. That last one was kind of key, though. We're not expected to have a crystal ball. Nobody expects us to be able to see the future. The appraisal framework requires us to consider what market participants believe will happen. What we think ourselves is not the point. So how do you accomplish a market analysis in times like these? Well, the best we can do is talk to market participants, buyers, sellers, brokers, landlords, tenants. Reach out and get feedback from all of them you know. And of course, the really good news here is that in many parts of the country, everyone is sheltering in place. If you haven't noticed, people are not only easy to reach right now, they're anxious to talk. And that's a good thing. So Jim, perhaps we could go back to you and you could talk about some of these questions that you'd want to ask these market participants.
Thanks, Stephanie. As you can see in the slide, listed are a number of questions that an appraiser could or should ask when analyzing market conditions. This list is not meant to be a list of what you must ask or everything that you could ask, but simply a sample of the questions. The appraiser must identify the pertinent questions to ask given their knowledge of local market characteristics and the property type for a particular assignment. As you can see, most of these involve discussions with market participants. As you know, appraisers read the market. We do not create the market. So discussions with market participants is certainly imperative.
So the appraisal report should include a discussion of the answers you get as part of the market analysis, the answers to these questions. But that discussion is not included as a disclaimer or an extraordinary assumption. And here's why. Disclaimers tend to sound as though you're absolving yourself from all responsibility regarding the development of the value opinion from pitching that tent. There's no reason why you need to do that. And if you do, you might leave your clients wondering why they bothered to get an appraisal, when the truth is you can still provide them with something very, very useful. That tent may be a bit cattywampus, but it can still serve a very good purpose. And the reason what you're saying in your report is not an extraordinary assumption is that an extraordinary assumption means you're assuming something to be true when it's uncertain to be true. We're not really doing that. We, as appraisers, aren't uncertain. The market is. We observe the market, and if the market is uncertain, well, that's the observation we make. So what's needed is a good market analysis discussion. And writing a good market analysis discussion should be your focus, well, always in every appraisal, but especially now until this crisis is over. So it's a good idea to include language in your letter of transmittal, and that's where I'd put it, that draws attention to the COVID-19 crisis and how it might be affecting real estate markets. I'd call this kind of language a significant factor, maybe, but it doesn't need a label. It should be short, to the point, and maybe reference a more detailed discussion in the body of the report. Another thing, it might be a good idea to include a reminder to the reader of your report, your client, and any other intended users, a reminder about the significance of effective date, the date of value. That is, the value opinion is in effect on the stated date of value, and things that happen after that date might change the value. You might also want to suggest to the client that they get or consider getting a new appraisal, an update, before too long, because market conditions may be changing and changing fast. So once this crisis is settled down, and it will, we should no longer need our reports to put a spotlight on it. Someday the effect of COVID-19 will not be something that we need to highlight or even talk about at all. So, 10 years from now or so, however long it takes, when the time is right, be sure to remove or not put that kind of language in the report if it's not relevant. Another really important point, be careful about drawing unsupported conclusions. It might seem logical that marketing times might be extended, and it might even be tempting to conclude that values have declined in a certain area because there's been a high number of cases reported in that area. But these conclusions might not be reasonable. Remember, the market isn't always logical. Make sure you have appropriate evidence, if not from actual transactions, from your researching, from talking to market participants before making such conclusions. Also, be careful when you analyze sales that occurred prior to the COVID-19 being recognized in the market as an issue. Ideally, you have sales that occurred since, but that's not likely to be realistic for a while anyway. So you might want to consider this. Negative market condition adjustments are a possibility. So Jim, could you perhaps sum up for us what we need to focus on?
Sure can. So to recap what Stephanie has said, and then here's a good recommended checklist of what we need to do. As we had said, certainly really good research with conversations with market participants. That's going to lead to some very good analysis, certainly whatever the data shows us. And a market write-up analysis in the appraisal report needs to be more than good. I mean, good is the minimum. We need to really show our clients the value add that we as appraisers can give to them. One of the goals of our appraisal report should be tell the client something about the property that they already do not know. And a good market analysis write-up is one of the ways that we can accomplish that goal. Certainly, as Stephanie mentioned, a significant factor in the letter of transmittal that alerts the client and other intended users about the COVID-19 crisis, and certainly the uncertainty that it has created in the marketplace. And again, don't forget about the importance of the date of value and the effective date of value. So the Appraisal Institute has two guide notes that are appropriate for this issue. Guide Note 10, which is appraising in the aftermath of a disaster, and Guide Note 12, which is analyzing market trends. Guide Note 10 discusses the aftermath of a sudden disaster versus a slower effect such as COVID-19. However, the guidance is similar and applicable to both situations. Guide Note 12 discusses the extent of the appraiser's responsibility when it comes to analyzing market trends, where that responsibility begins and where it ends. All guide notes are available on the Appraisal Institute website under the Professional Practice tab. They are available to all, not just those who belong to the Appraisal Institute. So feel free to direct others, both appraisers and clients, to them. So next, Stephanie and I put together 7 of the most frequently asked questions to provide further guidance on what we just presented. We felt it appropriate to go through these pretty quickly because they're very germane to put in real life what we had just said. So President Sherman will read the questions and Stephanie and I will discuss our suggested answers. With that, President Sherman, first question.
Sure, Jim. So is it okay to include an assumption that market conditions will return to normal in the future?
So the quick answer to that is no. Instead, you need to get a feel for what market participants anticipate and reflect those in your analysis. Also, what is normal? If you were to use language like that, you'd have to be specific about what normal means, and that could get challenging.
Thanks, Jim. So let me try this, Stephanie. I've been told to include an extraordinary assumption in my reports saying that the effect of COVID-19 on market values and marketability is uncertain, followed by a statement that the appraiser takes no responsibility for events that occur after the date of value. Is this appropriate?
Well, again, no, the short answer is no. And while it is important to include a discussion of the COVID-19 crisis in your appraisal report, very important to include that, you really aren't assuming anything with regard to it. So to have an extraordinary assumption, remember, you'd have to have establish a condition to be true on the date of value when it's uncertain that it is true. That's the definition of an extraordinary assumption. So what would that condition be? That the market is not being affected? Is that a reasonable assumption given what you know? Probably not. But there's another way to look at this. The whole point of calling something out as an extraordinary assumption is to draw the client and any other intended user's attention to it, which is what you're going to do anyway. So let's not get too hung up on the labeling. You're going to disclose the circumstances. Focus on making that a meaningful discussion.
Well, that helps, Stephanie. But Jim, let me try the question this way. Isn't the appraiser better protected from liability if they clearly label a discussion of the COVID-19 crisis as an extraordinary assumption?
So really, there's no reason why that would be the case. The more important thing is to have the discussion about the market, including the COVID-19 crisis, in the appraisal report.
All right, thanks, Jim. So, Stephanie, if the only comps I have sold prior to the advent of COVID-19 becoming an issue, how can I support a market conditions adjustment?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think it's important to keep in mind that sales aren't the only way to support adjustments. There's a bunch of different ways to support adjustments. Sales, actual sales, hard data may be the best way, but there are other ways to do it too. So some of the things you might want to do, ask the kinds of questions that we listed as part of your market analysis. Those questions can provide you with good information. Looking at listings now versus listings of comparable properties prior to the change in market can be very telling.
Well, that's helpful too. I appreciate that. So, Stephanie, let's keep going. So I talked to market participants and asked them the questions you talked about here and recommended, and they gave me all sorts of answers. There's no consistency in their responses. How do I draw any conclusions from this?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. But I think we've got to keep in mind that even if you get inconsistent responses, you still got good information. And the fact that their answers are all over the map is interesting in itself. So you should discuss the variety of responses you got in your appraisal report and consider them in your analysis. What's likely to happen over time is that those responses are going to become more consistent. But in the meantime, if it's acceptable to your client, you might see if you could provide a value opinion as a range instead of a pinpoint number. Now, that's not going to work for all clients, but it will for some. And if your client wants a pinpoint number, you could, you go with the best shot. That's really all you can do. Remember, market value is the most probable price. So you certainly want to beef up the discussion of how uncertain the market is right now and mention how they might need another appraisal when things settle down a bit more.
And Stephanie, this isn't one of the questions in front of us, but that last statement about suggesting that they might consider ordering another appraisal, that almost sounds self-serving, but it isn't. Why?
Well,
let me jump in.
It's really.
Yeah, go ahead.
You
Steph.
Want to jump in, Jim? Go ahead. Yeah. Okay.
Well,
you go ahead.
It's really no different from a doctor recommending a follow-up visit. It's the professional thing to do. As long as you frame the recommendations in the context of market conditions being changeable, it's not really self-serving, it's good advice.
Yeah, that helps, Jim. I appreciate that. So let's look at this scenario. I accepted an assignment back in February. The date of value is prospective, September 1st, 2020. That appraisal was based on the extraordinary assumption that no unforeseen events might significantly impact the market. I sent the client a draft report at the end of February before there was any evidence of COVID-19 that was going to be a big problem like it is now. And so now the client wants the final report. Can I finalize that report with the same extraordinary assumption?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question too, and it's a complicated one. So let me just kind of summarize what you just said there, what you're asking. So the appraisal assignment essentially began back in February before COVID-19 became a big issue in the marketplace. Gone ahead then, since then, provided the client with a draft report that had a value conclusion in it. And now the client wants the final report, but now we know more. And of course, and the only value opinion in this appraisal is a prospective value with a date of value in the end of the year sometime, towards the end of this year. And of course, that prospective value was based on an extraordinary assumption about no unforeseen events significantly impacting the market. Okay, so we won't get into the whole question about draft reports or the discussion about draft reports and whether or not they're appropriate and the problems inherent with those. If you do provide them, that could take us into the wee hours of the morning, and I don't think any of us want to do that. But the bottom line is your report hasn't gone out yet, and as of the date of your report, which will be the date you sign it and hit send it to your client, transmit it, as of that date, the date of report, the extraordinary assumption has to be reasonable. And the problem is, well, it may have been reasonable at the time you prepared the draft, it isn't reasonable anymore. So the only thing you can really do at this point, and gee, I hate to give an answer like this, but it's really the only thing you can do is to advise your client that your prospective value is going to have to be different. You can't send a report out with that same extraordinary assumption.
That's great. I got it. Thank you so much.
That you had in the draft,
Thank you
no
very
longer
much.
have a reasonable basis for it.
Okay, bye-bye.
So Stephanie, could you just repeat that last second? I think we had a little competition there.
Little interruption. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So the point is that you can't send out a final report now with an extraordinary assumption that market conditions are not anticipated to change when you know now that in fact they have. So you can't send out that report with that same extraordinary assumption that you had in the draft, since you no longer have a reasonable basis for that extraordinary assumption.
Great. Well, that's really, really helpful. Boy, that was a complicated question, but really good advice too. So at this point, we're going to move into our government relations section of the discussion. And Doug Potts, who is chair of the Appraisal Institute's Government Relations Committee, as well as Bill Garber, our Director of Governmental Affairs in Washington, D.C., are going to help out. And we've also gotten a really good assist here from Scott Reuter, Chief Appraiser for Residential Services at Freddie Mac. And I might have shortened your title a little bit there, Scott, but I think you'll be okay with that. So without further ado, let me turn it over to the Government Affairs guys. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. I hope you can all hear me, and it's wonderful to have such a large turnout for this really important discussion of rapidly evolving situation in both the appraisal profession and in the economy as a whole. And I will tell you that it's awfully nice to see everybody's houses in the background for those of us who are on camera, and a pleasure to be with you today. So I think one of the things we need to remember is to remain calm. We all have our panic room, as you can see, well insulated with all sorts of things that we can't seem to find at the grocery stores lately. And so it's a nice place, and I want to thank one of our folks at my work for having sent that out today, and I thought I'm going to definitely use that today because we need a little levity at a time when it's a little scary for us all. And I think that's one of the things that's a problem. I'm seeing a lot of client reactions, and everybody is calling everybody to know, both appraisers calling bankers like me, bankers calling appraisers to say, what can you do for us? What can we manage? And this is a really considerable issue. And part of the challenge here is that we have a certain level of risk that we're facing. We have an existing regulatory structure, both on the nature of standards, the nature of what is written up for lending transactions and or transactions for the various government-sponsored entities, and what they will allow and don't allow. And we have, for example, some discussions that will occur today. I won't be touching on them with any great depth, for Fannie and Freddie, but both agencies have come out with pronouncements and some discussions and some guidance, as well as the foundation has come out with some discussions. At the same time, we see in the news media a very active discussion in the as to what's going on in both the House and the Senate. Today, this almost minute-by-minute discussion of various kinds of interventions by the federal government, by the Treasury, to try to forestall even greater gyrations in the marketplace and in the stock market. So we have some legislative things that are being contemplated in both bodies to try to offer relief. And one of those things that's involved here is the appraisal process, especially as it deals with financing relief, to be able to make sure that we don't have a panic that is so severe that it tosses us into an almost irrevocable downward spiral. And we really don't know. I think as Jim and Stephanie have beautifully laid out for us, we won't know where we go, but we have to be able to disclose. And I don't think we want to be shying away from having to offer an opinion and staking a position in where we think things can go, while recognizing that there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding it. At the same time, we have state issues. One thing that I think is significant in the state issues is we have a quilt of state regulations as to how appraisals are done and how appraisal standards are being applied, and how areas like evaluations are going to be managed. And I think that one of the concerns for the appraisal community as a whole is whether evaluations will gain ever greater importance in certain levels of the financial sphere, especially if we think huge volumes of refinances will be occurring and some kind of consultations will be requested by the banks that would represent subsequent transactions that might otherwise be eligible for an evaluation in lieu of an appraisal. At the same time, we have this thing that I'm noticing right now. We have the question about inspecting property. The idea of social distancing is a play right now, and whether or not that represents an impact to the ability to inspect property. For instance, right now we have in a variety of states, and I just put this together this morning, and it's already out of date, but we had California, Connecticut, Delaware, Kentucky, Illinois, Louisiana, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania. In my home state of Missouri, we have the two core cities, St. Louis on the east side of Missouri and Kansas City Metro on the west side of Missouri, with various shelter-in-place requirements now. In fact, I'm at home in the shelter-in-place. We have various cities and counties in the United States. We have a whole new slew of probably a half a dozen states have now kicked in beyond these with shelter-in-place orders that are either now on the books and in effect or will be very shortly. So with those things in mind, we have to understand that this is probably going to stretch coast to coast at some point. And one of the things I think that we have to ask ourselves is whether we can count ourselves as an essential business that would be allowed to even go out to look at even the exterior of a piece of real estate. I think that's going to be something that we want to define, and I think we'll find that depending upon the state that you're operating in, you are, or maybe not are, an essential business that would have rights to be out in the open. On the other hand, we have this conundrum. For instance, where I live in St. Louis, you are not supposed to be going out if you're going to, unless you go to the doctor, a pharmacy, a grocery store, but you can go for a walk. So why can't you go out and make a drive-by, for instance? So I think that's going to be the kind of thing that we have to knock through as we get into this world that we're now inhabiting. And I think that we can expect that we're going to have some time here, that this is not going to be a week or two. This could be 30 or 60 or even 90 days. And it's going to depend upon how well these, what they call the diminishing of the curve effects will work in terms of having an effect on the viral stretch. So with that in mind, let's think about this issue. Do we want to even talk about the concept of it being an inspection, or maybe a visit, or maybe a data collection process, which I think is an important thing to ponder? And I think it will be important to check with your jurisdiction about whether you can operate in this essential environment versus non-essential environment. If there's a limitation on travel requirements, can you use local firms where that might be possible, especially if you're an appraisal firm that has a very active multi-state practice? Will you be able to do those kinds of travel? A great many corporate operations are restricting people from any kind of air travel. And if you do take air travel, whether it's for personal purposes or business purposes, you'll be required to self-quarantine for 14 days. So the issue here is alternative data to a direct observation by the appraiser. And some of the things that might be possible are borrower-provided data, or perhaps a phone interview with various individuals, borrowers or agents or other sources. Go and obtain photographs either provided by the borrower or another source, or even use data from the MLS. And of course, we all know that the MLS marketplace has shifted considerably, especially in the residential sector, because a great many MLSs are now using staged properties and staged photographs. There's also the concept of the virtual inspection. Someone is at the property already, and using mobile features like Skype or FaceTime, could literally walk around the property with a camera on and have a live virtual inspection. There's also the idea, I think that's worth remembering, that many properties have had prior appraisal reports that if you're trying to find out a way to get data that you can't otherwise get, you might need to rely on a prior appraisal report as a possible source, or some kind of building inspection or property condition assessment, possibly even seller disclosure forms for certain issues. Maybe other data sources like contractor reports or architect documents. There could be many other things, but I think it's worth noting that that's something to think about. So here's the point that I want to bring up. Because this is not just about appraisal matters, but because the evaluation space is an active marketplace now, I think it's important to remind ourselves of what the interagency, which was published in 2010 by the agencies, says about this issue about evaluations and also validations, which is a growing area of interest to the banks. And I highlighted some areas in yellow for you to take a look at, which is basically that there is not a direct requirement, similar and parallel to uniform standards, for an inspection. And I'm not sure they have even well defined the concept of an inspection, but I think we can see the outlines here. Basically that an inspection, if you choose to use one, and I bring that point up, that item 2 here should consider performing an inspection. And when an inspection is not performed, which means it is not automatically required to have any inspection, you need to demonstrate how you did determine factors that would have a bearing on the evaluation. And lastly, the extent to which an inspection was performed, which means the extent might be 0, that you used alternative sources entirely. With that in mind, I think it's very important that we have a clear description, be it an appraisal or an evaluation or a validation, to describe the extent and methods by which you collected the data on which you will rely, and proper citations of any underlying assumptions and limiting conditions that you might need to have in some form. And I'd love to hear Stephanie's and Jim's and Jeff's comments on that issue, Bill's comments, Scott's comments on that as we move through this day. So continuing on, I think I'm going to do a little prognosticating. I'll take that step that Stephanie said to discuss some things. And I think for those of you who've heard some of my presentations in the past, you know I've talked about, is there a coming storm? I think the perfect storm has indeed finally arrived. I think that it's pretty commonly accepted now that the economic cycle, the longest in the history since they've been recording things since 1854, is over. That we have a fully matured real estate bubble, and that SARS, COVID-19 is a massive systemic shock in the system. I think it's very likely that problem loans will fester and grow. The question is to what severity. Decline in bank earnings and stocks will be impacted. The question is to what severity. And there will be tremendous regulatory pressure to preserve loan quality. As we say in the banking business, all the bad loans are made in the good times. And that's going to be a major factor. And especially in the portfolio management area, there will be tremendous regulatory pressure. with extreme cost sensitivity and time pressure for the banks as their maturity reports come forward, and it's very difficult for them to manage the challenges of navigating, looking at a portfolio, be it a troubled portfolio or just ongoing management or sector analysis, as they have to handle a huge volume of considerations. With that in mind, especially for subsequent transactions that are scheduled, such as loan renewals or loan modifications or loan increases to existing debt, there will be a tremendous desire to preserve loan incumbency, meaning that they will want to keep those customers rather than create situations that would otherwise incent a customer to leave this bank in favor of a different bank. As well as the point to remember here is that renewing loans, just a straight renewal with no loan increase, only maintains the profit base of the institution that made that loan. It doesn't grow it. It only retains the earning capacity. And if you lose that customer, not only do you have to recover a new customer to replace that loan that disappeared, to grow your asset base, you have to yet add another customer on top of that, double the work. And demographically, we've had concerns about the appraiser supply, having sufficient appraisers to get the work done in a timely and economical way. Is there a huge tidal wave of demand coming to the banks? It's entirely possible. The question will be how to manage all the analytical requirements, and will internal staff, which has been, especially for subsequent transactions, been an area of interest, will that be sufficient and independent enough, especially as markets begin to show signs of stress? Will that be sufficient and independent enough to meet regulatory scrutiny? With that in mind, let's understand the concept of chasing risk by collateral valuations. We know for new loans that appraisals give excellent point values. And despite the fact that we've wanted to use range value, for instance, it's been very difficult. And that appraisals, by their very nature, struggle to identify long-term trends because of the way they've been generally structured. It's very difficult for them to prognosticate beyond their effective dates. And evaluations themselves, as point value tools, share the same problem. But what about existing loans? Yesterday's values were for yesterday's originations. And in fact, if they're several years old, they might have looked very lofty. But just before this moment, they looked, well, maybe they were okay after all. So it's a point of concern about whether or not we can trust recent valuations that might have replaced and overwritten prior valuations. With that in mind, what do we do about the subsequent transactions, especially in a time of uncertainty? Do we get new value opinions? And wouldn't we subject ourselves to the same risk as originations? Are there alternatives? So this graph in front of you, you'll see, shows some data that was actually compiled through the federal agency's Fed Reserve Bank Z1 Sales Index, which was the very sales index that was used to underscore the analysis by the agencies when they moved the commercial real estate thresholds from 250,000 to 500,000. And the blue line is the index itself, and the red line that you see here, I don't know if you see my mouse moving, is a red line is the general CPI. Now, please understand that this data kind of dies out at the beginning of 2016, and that's because that data file has not been updated to the best of my knowledge, so I can't easily get that for you. But you can see the enormous growth of the indexes in the period following the crisis, and moreover, how it corrected back to a reverse mean and then has climbed since. And in the 4 years since 2016, it has climbed significantly more. So that's an area of concern. With that in mind, let me bring this concept up. A very recent Market Watch document from late January carries the same overall tenor of shift in property prices by a couple of different indices. This data coming out of Capital Analytics, which underscores that very same thing. Even though the lower graph and the bottom half of that graphic is the rent changes, which haven't gone up anywhere near as much, and in some cases have gone down. And what's really underscores is that capital rates have been the driving force behind a great deal, reflecting the buyer preferences to buy real estate, accept less return. So with that in mind, let's understand what's driving that in part. Partially what's driving that is the expansion on the left-hand side of your screen, the expansion of the federal balance sheet. By the way, this is the very most recent data out of the Fed Reserve of St. Louis that tracks this information nationally and shows the decline of the balance sheet over a period of time and then the resurgence of quantitative easing. And it does not yet reflect the enormous quantitative easing that has been recently announced by the Fed in the last 2 weeks. So that's a huge issue. At the same time, on the right-hand side, this is the repo market, which is the repo market is specifically, so you understand it, it is the repurchase obligations of short-term instruments and is funded by liquidity in the Fed. And there has been a massive increase of this over time. So these two forces are examples of both interventions to stabilize the economy. At the same time, they represent driving forces that have driven people to long-term hard assets like real estate and paying very lofty prices for them in lieu of buying stocks or bonds, which are easier and quicker to sell, but are much more subject to volatility. That would be a factor. So this is an example of the same data from the Z1 file over just a short period of time from 2007 to 2017, suggesting the danger of the climbing market. And the issue here is you see an origination and two subsequent transactions that would have been backed by an appraisal report. And the green star, you can see, was an origination in 2010 at the bottom of the market when we had troughed out. And the value was appraised at $100 a foot. And by the way, this data is just tracking the Z1 file data. I'm not suggesting that this data should be the tool by which we would do a validation methodology. But it is a suggestion of what could happen if you were to get reappraisals as point value thinking, point to point to point, without any kind of sense of trending, that we might recognize the risks. Now, so you see the loan to value is $60 a square foot. And then 3 years later, a typical amount of time lag, you get a new appraisal. Now it's up 20%. You again give it a 60% loan to value. You've now loaned $72 a foot if you would allow an increase. At the same time, if you do the third renewal 3 years later, you are now $160 a foot. You're a little concerned about loftiness in the market, so you trim the LTV back by roughly 10%. But you've still loaned $88 a foot. And despite everything we've talked about, you've had an increase in prices of 60%. And even with the haircut, you have increased your loan risk by 47%. So there's a concern, is there an alternative method? So here's a thought. You could look at this way. Imagine that if we use history as a reflection for what we might be facing in the future, and recognizing the potential, that you might consider how a validation methodology would allow you some level of control in an appraisal update perspective. You made an origination in 2007 at the peak of the market just before the bottom blew out, and you had a bad move. The market goes down a huge amount at the time of the third year renewal. You've dropped an enormous amount of money. You've roughly lost 25% of the asset value. However, there are techniques that can be available to identify that piece. And at that point, you lock the number and you move forward for another renewal. Now, the question is what do you do? Do you carry that number forward for eternity? Or do you re-examine every 3 years, which is what we're using as a presumed amount of time change? You then go and you double check market conditions again and market evidence again. And I think Stephanie has identified very clearly that it's very difficult, as Jeff mentioned in the question, what do you do if you have old data? You're always going to have the problem of old data across an inflection point. And I've observed this directly, having been through the last big roller coaster, that it takes a year or two for that data to come into the marketplace where you can observe it and opine about it. And it's very difficult. And I think we have to recognize that we don't want to say that there's no change, as Stephanie, I think, brilliantly identified. On the other hand, you're going to have to say that you're going to have to stake a position and say we can't be absolutely certain, and the idea of a range value has some real merit there, if it's allowed. But you can see how you could go forward. And then lastly, we have the final renewal, which really would suggest the data that we've more than recovered. But because of the protective nature of the concept of relationship value, you might be able to offer some protection at some point, because you can never go above the gold standard of what an appraisal requires. So here's an example from real life of a capitalization model stress test system that had suggested a piece of real estate that was originally appraised in 2015 with a recheck in 2018. What happened? We have the red in expenses and the blue box in NOI, and we see that the appraiser had assigned an 8.5 cap rate for a value of about $6.5 million. And over time, due to market conditions change or occupancy change or economic performance change, and the loan balance, of course, was going down the whole time, but because of those unique market conditions, the NOI had dropped 20%. And I think, given the nature of the marketplace that we're about to enter, that's entirely possible that we'll see a significant decline in NOI. And what do? So we could look at the fact that in this particular case, indexing cap rates, something we're all trained to do in our coursework, how you can look at cap rates and measure them against each other in a relationship value kind of way. The cap rates actually climbed a little bit, and as a result, the value fell rather significantly. It fell from about $6.5 million down to about $5.5 million, which is unusual in this case because we've seen cap rates do almost nothing but go up. However, one thing you could be offering is a scenario analysis, which was to recognize other potential factors. And in this particular case, there was a case of the tenant. We had a major tenant that was on month-to-month and the potential that they would leave. And so what would happen if they left? And a vacancy analysis on top of that suggested the following. So I'm showing you how the LTV has moved up. The value has dropped 15%. And lastly, that after vacancy risk was factored in, the value fell even farther. Now, whether or not that would be a risk to the financial institution is another matter. But I think that those are the elements I've got. And I think this may be my last slide. I can't quite remember. Let me just tap it, and then I'm going to hand it back over. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon. Thanks, Doug, appreciate that. And we're gonna turn direction a little bit, and we've been fortunate to have the resources from Freddie Mac made available to us this afternoon to walk through some of the lender notices and bulletins that were released from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac this morning that followed a directive from FHFA that was also announced this morning. Scott Reuter, Chief Appraiser with Freddie Mac, is going to give us an outline of the lender notices and the direction that they've provided to loan sellers. Welcome. I can control the slides here. And if you want to just give us a quick overview, greatly appreciate it.
No, that's great, Bill, and thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I first want to thank all my friends at AI, Bill, Jeff, Doug, Jim, and everyone for the hard work. And I want to start by saying we have had the entire appraiser community in the forefront of our thoughts during this crisis. So I, in turn, thank you for the opportunity to join you here today, Bill, and offer a few comments. You did me the favor of only having 2 slides, so we'll jump right in. But as Bill explained, both enterprises today announced temporary flexibilities that are effective immediately for all mortgages that are in process and remain in place for mortgage applications received on or before May 17th, 2020. We understand that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there may be instances where a seller seller to us as a lender is unable to obtain an interior inspection of the subject property through you all, the appraisal community. So as a result, we're allowing some temporary exceptions to our property eligibility appraisal requirements. Fannie Mae, we've worked very closely with our friends at Fannie Mae on this. They published a lender letter today, 2020-04. We publish a bulletin. We publish bulletin 2020-5. Those are been circulating. They're out, and you're welcome to reference them. We are going to be publishing, we hope by late today, the first wave of FAQs that will surround the guidance that we're providing. I think that's really where the rubber hits the road. If you're a practicing appraiser, you want to know what type of report we're allowing in certain instances, where we're going to allow some exterior and desktop flexibility in lieu of traditional interior and exterior appraisals. I'll cover a little bit on the next slide what we're referencing in the way of revisions to the scope of work, certifications and limiting conditions, and then really on the waivers. So before you flip to the next slide, Bill, we did, Freddie Mac had a more conservative box, if you will, on our waivers. And the only air quote expansion that we've done on waiver capability is just expand to meet the Fannie Mae guidelines. So in terms of the various LTV thresholds for primary residence single family homes. So there's been a lot on the internet, a lot on the blogs about the waivers, and I think really what we're doing is not expanding, we're aligning with Fannie, so that may provide some relief on low risk loans. I think Bill has inset on the next slide, pardon me. I think Bill has inset on the next slide, the loan purpose, the LTV ratio, and the various details around the permissible appraisal types for the different thresholds. To accommodate these flexibilities, you're welcome to look at this, and as you link to our bulletin and again to Fannie's lender letter, there'll be considerable more detail in terms of where you're permitted to do what. And to accommodate these flexibilities, we did a couple of things. So I was on a call earlier that really spoke to how linked we are to appraisal forms in the single family space. So we've got a 2055 form, there's various different forms out there, but to accommodate these flexibilities and be able to operationalize this quickly, we have allowed modification of the 1004 Form 70 in its current use. The flexibilities that we're permitting in using these existing appraisal forms, both Freddie and Fannie have worked together, and we've developed scope of work documents, which are either linked or provided as attachments to each bulletin or lender letter for the desktop appraisal and for exterior only inspections. Each scope of work document includes modified language that will allow and ensure the sections appropriately support these temporary exceptions and allow and ensure the appraisers are not, they're producing a credible report and they're not producing a misleading report. In our FAQs, and I'll answer to the degree that I can if we have a short Q&A, I believe, as well as just being able to address this now, is I'm able to speak to what's been publicly released already. And again, I think we're really working to provide a lot of appraiser practical guidance in the FAQs relative to a lot of questions I'm sure they're going to have. As it relates to the modified scope of work, limiting conditions, and certifications, these are not going to require any technology or software creation. These are available right now. This is language that we intend for the appraiser to copy and paste right into a text addendum, and they're able to use immediately. So again, I don't know if we've thought of everything, but the goal, it was with all the collected minds to ensure that maybe we did think of this fairly comprehensively to ensure that we kept the health and the safety of our appraiser community and candidly everyone, first and foremost. One, two, leverage where we can what tools we have and what flexibilities we can operationalize and put in place very quickly. And so those are really the main elements and top of hand.
Thank you, Scott. And hopefully we'll have a chance to do some questions as well at the end. I know that this is one that a lot of people have been turning to for direction. I'm going to go ahead and proceed into some other issues that we've been tracking at the Institute's Washington office. Obviously, everybody's been drinking through a fire hose over the last couple of weeks, and that's true of us as well. The policy changes have been, I think, pretty enormous, and they're just beginning as well, as we're seeing the government swiftly try to take actions to resolve some of the market functionality concerns. There's been a bevy of guidance that's been released just in the last couple of days, and even this morning from the agencies. The Federal Reserve Board has issued a notice around CMBS market fluctuation. There's a widespread concern in the market on liquidity in the commercial mortgage-backed securities market, and providing liquidity to the wave of potential loans that may be at risk in the commercial market, given concerns about rent payment and the like. So the FRB is trying to open up the lending facilities to include the CMBS market as one corrective or measure that would try to provide liquidity to the market. The agencies have also issued some guidance on loan modifications, and it's fairly consumer friendly, essentially guiding institutions to work with the borrowers as much as they can in loan modifications. And it's a carryover from some of the guidance that we saw during the housing crisis as well. And then late last week, there was an FAQ released on coronavirus. So all of these documents are linked here. And there were a couple of FAQs relating to inspections and appraisal, 12 and 13 in particular, relating to how should COVID-related issues be addressed in appraisal reports, and the agency saying they should consult with appraisers on how to address any short-term temporary reduction in income stream produced by an income-producing real estate has been affected by COVID-19. It goes without saying. There's going to be more to come, and certainly agencies are going to be looking at various resources that they have at their disposal to try to address some of the current market concerns and conditions as they relate to examinations of institutions. We are expecting policy updates at some point, probably as soon as this week, from FHA and the VA on their policies. We were on a call right before this webinar with them that they indicated that they had been working on guide updates, handbook updates, and the like, and they have their procedures, processes that they have to go through for review and approval. I think that there is some goal of aligning their policies as much as they can, and today's announcements from the GSEs might provide some guidance for them as well, but although it's yet to be determined and it has not been released yet. So just keeping a lookout on that. On the congressional side, we are seeing some action, of course, relating to financial relief packages, the so-called round 3 package of COVID-19 relief. There's votes that have been taking place on the Senate side today. They have not been able to approve their procedural or go through their procedural measure to bring the package down to the Senate floor for a final vote. There's negotiations ongoing with some of the particular provisions. There's a huge lending facility that's been proposed by Senate Republicans that would be potential similar to a TARP-like arrangement for the agencies to potentially implement distressed industries and the like. The last figure I saw was a $500 billion package that was on the table. They have not been able to secure the necessary votes to get that through. This is also the package that includes direct payments to individuals below certain salary income levels. That's going to be worked on. Last I saw, there were still votes potentially tonight on that subject. And just a moment ago, I saw that the House Democrats have released a proposal, their round 3 package, and it actually interestingly includes some discussion about all of these issues we've been talking about today: appraisal inspections and inclusion of certain allowances for desktop and exterior only appraisal inspections, given the various orders that are in place. My quick read of the legislation is that it would direct the FHFA and FHA to establish policies in this regard, and further, there be a stipulation that appraisers utilize an extraordinary assumption within their appraisal reports in that regard. We will get a copy of that proposed legislation posted to our coronavirus website, but needless to say, this inspection issue has been one that everybody's been grappling with, including folks on Capitol Hill who have heard concerns from consumers and lenders and appraisers as well about some of the health and safety risks that we're facing today. The states are very active in this regard. I think we posted here some of the actions from the ASC Appraisal Subcommittee. They've made it clear they're going to be very flexible on state compliance issues, on education renewals and the like, with state appraiser regulatory authorities. There's been some flexibility and guidance provided by the AQB and TAF relative to converting classroom coursework into online programs. And essentially, if you have a classroom program that's already approved for online education, then course providers can generally make that conversion available, assuming that it's consistent with state law. Later this week, the foundation is going to be hosting a webinar with the state regulators where a lot of these issues are going to be discussed. And as been previously mentioned, we've been going through these stay-at-home shelter orders, which have been coming out by the minute, really the last couple of days, and they are really all over the place. The first of the big ones was the California executive order related to COVID-19. I think generally speaking, not specific to California, but just generally on the orders, what we're seeing is that there are varying definitions over what's essential and non-essential. And some states have made it very clear that real estate appraisal is included in an essential function. And you've seen examples in Illinois, Indiana, Delaware, and Ohio that are specific to appraisal, allowances for essential employment, including appraisal. Those are abundantly clear. While there are 4 or so of those examples, there are some that are equally muddy and unclear. California and their order utilizes a reference to something called CISA, which basically is a short or an acronym for the Patriot Act and some of the Department of Homeland Security cybersecurity rules around critical infrastructure. There is a definition of critical infrastructure, and it includes a broad classification of industries, including financial services. Under the CISA Homeland Security definition, they talk about services that support financial institutions' functions. And there's also some guidance that was released earlier this morning that provides further illustration of this. And they talk similarly about those that are providing support services and those who are supporting capital markets activities. One could argue that appraisal falls into these camps. I've seen some people argue differently from that if they've talked to some of the state officials. So our best advice is for people to have this open question, to try to work with us and the Institute's chapters to try to seek the needed clarification from the available authorities, including the governor's offices, the Attorney General's offices, and the state appraiser licensing boards are all going to be working in concert with this. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but they're really, as I was saying, they're kind of all over the place on their application. Some are very restrictive. Some are very clear. The Illinois case is a good example of that, where they've specifically called out appraisers. Ohio, Delaware, and Indiana have basically this executive order from Illinois, and others are, looking at it somewhat differently, and maybe looking at broader categories of banks and financial institutions and the like. We've provided copies of these orders within the resources page of this webinar, and we will be updating them on our coronavirus website up on the Appraisal Institute's main homepage as well, for people to refer to these. Delaware is an interesting example. They have not included real estate agents and brokers as an essential business, but they've declared that activities related to real estate, which presumably includes appraisal, are considered essential activities. So again, varying degrees of interpretation relative to these orders. We're also seeing orders come out relating to things like building inspections at the local level. Georgia has waived all city and county code inspections, and they're providing for alternatives to the building community to get private services performed to verify code compliance. Those also need to be reviewed and discussed locally, need to be considered by appraisers, obviously, from an appraisal standpoint. Deficiency concerns and the like down the line. This may become a building issue if it starts to catch hold on a wider level. So on the orders issue, our best advice is to contact the appraiser licensing authority for guidance and clarification. Governor's offices or the AGs themselves. You can work through our office or through our chapters. And also, of course, at all times, it's important to communicate with your clients over these issues and your scope of work as an appraiser. So that's what I've got. There's a lot going on there, and we wanted to do a brain dump on the various issues that we've been facing today, and we hope that this has been helpful, at least in sharing the intelligence, whatever that we have, with our broader membership. So Jeff, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, Bill. Let me go off script here a little bit and go back to something that you said, which was really news to me, and it sounds like that there's part of the House proposal that might invoke the necessity for appraisers using an extraordinary assumption. So relative to that, am I correct in assuming, pardon the double entendre here, but assuming that that's extraordinary assumption relative to the interior condition when you're only doing an exterior viewing of the property?
Yeah, as I understand it, the House Democrats' proposal includes a provision that would stipulate policies be created and establish various guidance and whatever regulations necessary from what appears the FHA and from the FHA, well, which covers Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, relating to, exterior inspections and desktop appraisals. Now, the GSEs have done relative to the policy announced today. By my initial read and based on prior feedback with the staff on the committee, there's a provision also to stipulate that an appraiser can utilize an extraordinary assumption that the interior condition of the property is consistent with the exterior condition of the property. That's been proposed in the House Democrats version of the round 3 package that and literally just introduced during the middle of this webinar.
So let me just go out on a limb here, and you correct me, or Doug, or Stephanie, or Jim. But I think the Appraisal Institute would definitely be on the side of supporting that. It certainly clears up potential liability for our members that is sort of inherent when we have to do these things. So is that how you recognize it? Or Stephanie, are you sympathetic with this?
Well, I think it has been consistent with our views over the current environment and the situation that appraisers may be, that they might be having to utilize information from third parties, and there's from a liability perspective and from a standpoint of disclosure to the users of appraisal services, that the use of an extraordinary assumption has applicability and is appropriate here. And I'll let Stephanie comment to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, we would be concerned that if an appraiser doesn't know for certain what the interior of the property is like because they didn't have the opportunity to see it, and they're relying on information that, while they might believe it to be accurate information, they don't know for sure. They're making the assumption that it is, and that assumption needs to be disclosed. And not just an assumption that it's the same as the outside. It's an assumption about what are the features of the inside, not just its condition, but what exactly is the inside like.
Sure, and I think some of the advice. Excuse me. I think some of the advice that you had earlier relative to, how can we find things out about market conditions also applies to the interior condition of the home. So we can talk to the owner or the current occupant. We could ask them to take photographs. We could ask them to do a FaceTime walkthrough of the property, or even record that and send it to us. So there are a lot of different ways of getting more information about the interior than just by viewing the exterior. And appraisers, we should always take those steps to try to provide the most information and the best information to our clients.
That's correct, and that's part of the appraiser's scope of work, the extent to which the property is inspected, and the appraisal report needs to address that. What was the scope of work applied with regard to the property inspection, or rather the gathering of the relevant information regarding the relevant characteristics of the property? What did the appraiser do to get that information?
Sure.
Now, Jeff, if I could, I don't know that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have shared this view on extraordinary assumptions. So I don't know if Scott might be willing to address maybe their viewpoint on this particular issue. That would probably be helpful for appraisers.
Sure.
Yeah, Bill, hi. And I know you and I talked a little bit about this back in the back when appraisal modernization and innovation discussions were happening prior to the crisis. So, a couple of things. The revised scope of work and certifications that we're providing remove, in our view, the requirement for the appraisal to be submitted subject to an extraordinary assumption. So if adequate information about the subject property is not available from a credible source, then the desktop or exterior only inspection appraisal flexibility that we're offering is not acceptable. And appraisers continue and must have data sources that they consider to be reliable. And the assumption that data sources are correct is not considered an extraordinary assumption. So I think that's our position. And again, we recognize that the existing appraisal forms did not accommodate a revised scope of work. So that's why we stood up the the temporary modified language that's to be used and associated with these reports. I think Jeff and Doug both touched on it a little bit in their comments relative to some of the flexibility we're providing from a desktop perspective, and really the availability in a lot of cases of the amount of data that's out there from other sources, particularly in a purchase money environment. It's very likely there's going to be a lot of data, a lot of photographs, a lot of information that the appraiser can access through the internet. They can go through their normal diligence and verification to a degree of that information. So that's that element really rather relative to the data collection. 1, 2, it's important to note we've removed in our modified cert 10, which also allowed some flexibility. That's the one that was the recognition the appraiser may have relied on information from an interested party to give the appraisers flexibility here, that if they happen to know, if they happen to be able to verify and do that additional diligence or property verification, that it's possible that they're able to utilize that data, obviously explaining and being very clear and disclosing what they did. So so that's hopefully at least an answer there, Bill, for you.
Yeah, it is, and I think that helps get us a little closer to an understanding of this new environment that we're in, Scott. So I certainly appreciate that.
No, you're welcome.
We're getting, yeah, thank you, and we have like 7 or 8 minutes theoretically left till our time deadline, but I think we can extend it a little bit. I do have a number of questions here that I'd like to get to some of these if I could. And so unless anyone else on the panel have anything they'd like to say at the moment? Okay, the first question is from Ryan Whitelaw. What are your thoughts on negative time adjustments at this time? By all accounts, values will be decreasing. Should we wait for empirical data prior to making adjustments, or is it appropriate to make an adjustment now based on anecdotal information? So again, at the risk of usurping Jim and Stephanie's information, the first thing I want to do is point everybody to the copy of these slides that will be available afterwards, because there's critical information about our market analysis, the types of questions that you can ask that will help give you the clues from the market participants about what's happening today. So I think there probably is no, or likely to not be, very robust empirical evidence yet. Maybe in a month there we'll start to see things. So this type of questioning of market participants that Stephanie and Jim were talking about earlier is extremely critical. It's what we have to do in order to be able to discern what the market is doing today, what the market perceives value at. Now, I'll be quiet for a minute and let our 2 USPAP experts chime in on this. So, Jim, would you like to comment?
Thanks, Jeff. Well, I think that you really hit it on the head. The key is we should not guess at what the market might be doing. We should make an opinion as to what the market is doing. So we make a negative time adjustment when, through our discussions with market participants, indicates that the properties have or do require a negative time adjustments. As Stephanie previously mentioned, one of the ways of doing this is, if there's not actual sales, look at listings of properties. A year ago, a property listed for X amount of dollars or X amount of dollars per square foot, and now today a very, very similar building is listed for less amount of money. Again, is that empirical? No, but it is also an indication that the market is reacting to the virus situation. So this is not a yes/no answer, but I would caution you do not make adjustments based on hearsay. You make it based on evidence of the marketplace. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Stephanie, you want to piggyback?
I don't think I have anything to add to what you both said there. I think that was very well said. We can't be making guesses, but we do have to be looking at market reactions to things and doing everything we can to get that information from market participants about what the reactions are.
Well, thanks, Stephanie. That's really great. So I'm seeing the second question here. I'm not sure if I follow it 100%, but let me try. It says, why did Fannie Mae allow reps and warranty relief, i.e. 100% insurance / no risk to the lender? The lender has no risk with waivers and desktops, which are higher risk products. It's a game changer for the residential appraiser. And that was from Matthew George. Doug or Scott or Bill, would one of you care to take a shot at that?
This is Scott. I can take a stab and then I can hand it over to Bill and Doug. I can tell you from being in the working meetings the past week and a half that the rep and warranty relief, at least for Freddie Mac, was not a driver in this, but it was a benefit. Meaning by the time we decided that the quickest way to operationalize this was to utilize the 1004 Form 70, one of the benefits was that form is submitted to the UCDP portal and is able to be read and scored by both CU for Fannie Mae and LCA for Freddie Mac. So that was just a benefit to us in terms of any flexibility we're providing. We have an additional lens and we have an additional view of that report quality and the additional risk that may represent. The rep and warrant coming with that is largely based, it's just a rep and warrant for value. So our lenders and our sellers are still on the hook for marketability and condition. So it's enough is in place structurally that we felt that rep and warrant relief, by the fact that it can be read by those two tools, was really how we arrived at being able to continue to offer the rep and warrant relief.
Yeah, I might be too early to say. I don't know how much of a game changer that really is. I don't know that it was intended to change much of anything by the conversations that I've heard. I think that the GSEs have just been trying to implement a policy within the structure that they have, try to make that work. It's seemingly, I think, trying to make the best of a tough situation as I've seen it.
Thanks, Bill. That brings a little clarity to that. It was a little technical for me, and I appreciate you guys helping me out with that. So the next question I have is from Mitchell Krieger. Question is, during this lockdown crisis, is it acceptable to only provide drive-by or exterior-only site inspections with limited exterior-only photos? So let me throw that over to Stephanie.
Well, I think is it permissible with regard to whom, who is setting the requirements there? I mean, certainly under USPAP, an exterior only is allowed. USPAP does not require a full property inspection. It doesn't even require any inspection. So from a standards perspective, it's allowed. I think it really goes to the issue of your client and client's regulator as to what they're permitting. But there's nothing in standards that would prohibit that.
Stephanie, would it be fair to say that the intended use might be impacting the inspection requirements also?
Yeah, well, it's intended use and intended user and the requirements that they bring to the assignment, whether it's Fannie Freddie requirements or guidelines, I should say, or client specific requirements of any sort. What do they bring to the table by being an intended user and for that intended use? So that's an important question.
So maybe
Jeff,
there's an
if I could
underlying
just add on to that.
Sure, Jim.
Yeah, let me just add on to that. I think that, as we go through this crisis, we need to be careful that we just don't take the typical engagement letter or engagement instructions from our client in the past and just assume them to be the same today. Every assignment should be considered different. We need to start having one-on-one conversations with our clients to discuss the appropriate scope of work given the intended use. And if that means that a drive-by appraisal is appropriate, that's something you and your client agree to. So I'm just kind of piggybacking on what Stephanie just said. We cannot assume that everything is going to be the same for every assignment. Communication with your client to make sure before you start the assignment, everyone is on the same page and expectations are going to be met so there's no surprises at the end. Thanks.
Boy, Jim, that was excellent advice there, very much so. And let me go back to this question for a minute because I almost think there might be a hidden part to it. So he's saying, is it acceptable to only provide drive-by or exterior-only site inspections with limited exterior? And maybe the question is, what about appraiser safety in this environment? Because I don't feel comfortable going into the houses or going into the properties, contacting people, you know, getting involved with that. So is this acceptable? And I guess the answers we've given probably provide that to you, but we're extremely concerned about individual appraisers' health, safety, and well-being in this. We all have to make these decisions for ourselves, and we need to be careful, and we need to follow our government guidelines about interactions. So would anyone else care to pile onto that thought?
Yeah, this is Scott, Jeff, and I think I'll piggyback on that as well as off of Jim's statement. I agree completely, and just to underscore, I think, you know, the flexibility, at least from where we sit, that the GSEs are allowing is just that. It's just flexibility, and it is ultimately the appraisers who are going to determine, not just from a scope of work and adequacy of information, if they're able to do some of these desktop or exterior products. We're going to trust them 100%. If they're in a market and they don't have enough data, there's not enough online resources they can't gather and complete, then they're going to need to escalate up, and that's fine. One, two, to your point, health and safety absolutely top of list, and also we're allowable by law. You know, Bill Garber went through essential, non-essential. We're not opining to override that in any regard. If there's a state that it has drawn a hard line, the appraiser obviously has to respect that, and that's, again, that's all we're framing up are those flexibilities. And I would encourage appraisers to continue to check both the Freddie Mac and the Fannie Mae sites for continued updates and flexibilities as this crisis evolves and things may change. What we announced today is good through 5/17. That was a date that our regulator provided to us. So, you know, we anticipate there'll be more added, more changes, and as this changes and more and additional flexibilities need to be introduced, we're going to be monitoring that very closely.
That's great, Scott. And hey, Scott, I just have to say this is the first time I've done an event with you where you don't have a whiteboard.
I can try to
whiteboard. So.
I have my pad. It's white, so.
You're taking over for Carl Rove now. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, sir.
Okay. Dear. So the next question I'm seeing here from Gary Storr, I can't read the whole last name, I'm sorry, but it says, I'm reviewing an appraisal that includes the following extraordinary assumption. Given the uncertainties of market impacts at present, we have not attempted to quantify the short-term or long-term impact, if any, in either or both cases of the COVID-19 outbreak. Okay, Stephanie.
Well, that's really not an appropriate statement to make. The appraiser does need to attempt to quantify. It's a very difficult task, but we should be looking at what are market participants' reactions. And that is a very tough task right now because market participant reactions are going to be all over the map. And a lot of people aren't really, they aren't really reacting yet. They're taking a pause, and that makes it tough. But that's all good information, and that's part of what we have to factor in. But an appraiser can't just wash their hands of the process. That's what we do. We look at markets. We talk to market participants. We find out what's going on, and that's part of the assignment. That's part of part of the appraisal process. We can't just assume it away.
This is Doug. I think I'd like to chime in on that. I think one of the things that is important here, and I think Stephanie really underscored it, the chaos in the reaction of the marketplace is itself a reaction of the marketplace and is a sign of uncertainty. And I think that it's one thing to just simply gloss it as an issue. It's another thing to say that we can't identify any kind of shift in trend because of the wide and disparate reactions in the marketplace participants available for interview. And because of that, we can't really opine a position or a direction. But I think it'd even be okay to say we either can't opine one or we're going to make an opinion out of this lack of data and decide. And I think, Stephanie, you've identified very clearly. It's okay to identify market data other than sales, that there are other data sources that you can look to. And you can look to financial information sites, and you can look to the cap rate trending data is also retrospective. But you can look at more liquid sources such as bonds, such as stocks, as indicators, and I think you can make some prognostications out of things that aren't real estate related at some level. To either say, we're going to make a downward adjustment based upon these factors, or we're not going to make any adjustment because at this point, the data is static. It's widely dispersed, and it's static. I think you can do that as opposed to just issuing an opinion and say, we don't know, we can't know, therefore. Stephanie, would you tend to concur with that idea?
Well, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, that it's really not the appraiser's opinion. It's not our opinion. That's really what matters. It's our opinion of the market's opinion. And,
right.
Again, as I said earlier, the market may be confused and not have a well-formed opinion. But that's good information for the appraiser. That's what we observe. As appraisers, we're reading the market. The market's a confused mess. That's our conclusion. And we go from there. It's tough, but that's what we have to do.
So let me just help conclude that, Steph. So if we observe that the market's a confused mess, we make a zero adjustment. Is that right?
Well, we may or may not make a zero adjustment. We talk to people. We look at what trends are available. Look at what information we do have available. It's a matter of sometimes you just have to do the best you can with what you have, and you might not have much, but you still draw a conclusion from the information that you have available to you. And that information might tell you that, yes, a zero adjustment is appropriate, or a negative adjustment, or a positive adjustment.
This is Scott, Jeff, and pardon me, Stephanie, for jumping in, but I think she said something earlier that was very significant about, and Jim mentioned it too, about really having your finger on the pulse of any current marketing or listing activity. And this is where our realtor friends, I think, could be a real asset in terms of how they may be thinking of and positioning and marketing properties for sale, even in the past week or two, and what they're considering. Not that it's, within a market where there's very little to grab a hold of, that may be just a very, very important piece of information.
That is doubling down, Scott. I appreciate that. And the last comment on this one I'd like to make is that a zero adjustment is an adjustment. So remember, you're not saying the market isn't doing anything. You're making a zero adjustment here. So it is a conclusion about what the market is doing. So let me move to the next question that I have here. It's from Michael Rome. It says, is it not prudent to state that values might not be stable in current economic climate? And then in parens, he's saying, effectively a disclaimer of the reduced liability of the value derived. So Jim, you want to take a shot at that one?
Well, with all due respect, that's exactly what we're asking the appraisers not to do. And I guess I need to be direct and to the point on that, because of the fact that we analyze the market and we make a decision. We should not be making disclaimer statements diluting the validity of our opinion of value. That's why the clients hire us, to give them our opinion of value. So I would hope, based on the content of this webinar, that appraisers would realize that market analysis is the key. Make a decision, even if it's a decision based on unstable information. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. So here's a question directly for Stephanie. How do we put the marketing time for how long it would take to sell if the value may likely be declining over that period of time? And that's from Edward Nigis.
Okay, so this gets into a kind of a big complicated topic, but marketing time is not something that's required by USPAP. Marketing time meaning the answer to the question, how long will it take to sell the property and put it on the market as of the date of value going forward, that is not part of the appraisal process per se. What is part of the appraisal process and what is required by USPAP is exposure time, which is the answer to the question, how long would it have taken the property to sell if it had sold, a consummation of the sale as of the date of value. So it's prior to the date of value. And still, for exposure time, the process of coming up with that is the same as it always was. You look at how long your comparable properties took to sell, and you get your information from there. Marketing time, that's kind of a little bit of crystal ball gazing there. That's projecting, that's forecasting into the future. And unless you're going to have an underlying assumption that market conditions are going to remain relatively stable, it's very difficult to do that because you don't know. It's a tough question to answer. I do see appraisers routinely providing a marketing time in their appraisal report when the client hasn't specifically asked for it. You don't need to do that, and you may be going out on a limb more than you need to, or should with that. That's a tough call to make, that kind of projection.
Thank you, Stephanie. So I have a question here from Catherine Tantinen. Are there any samples we can include in our reports regarding COVID-19? Either Jim or Stephanie there.
Sample, I assume they're talking about the kind of language that I had suggested be in the letter of transmittal, for example, a significant factor kind of language. There is some good language out there. It really just, is going to get to the point about this being an ongoing crisis that can be impacting the market. Language that talks about the date of value is this date, and the value is as of this particular date, the date of value. Value may be subject to change. All values are. That kind of very brief language. So there is some good language that can be used. I've seen a lot of examples of bad language, I'm afraid. Jim, did you have something to add on to that?
No, I appreciate it. I was going to take a stab at it because there was silence there, but you handled it much better than I. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going through the question list. Here's one for Scott from Kenneth Dix. It says, please reiterate that the term desktop is specific to what Fannie and Freddie expect for the scope of work, and it does not validate any proprietary desktop appraisal forms that are currently available in the marketplace.
Would you read just the first part of that question again, Jeff? I'm sorry.
Sure.
I want to make sure.
Sure. It says, please reiterate that the term desktop is specific to what Fannie and Freddie expect for scope of work, and it doesn't validate any proprietary desktop software, I think is where the question's going.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Kenneth. I think that really the intent here was to utilize the terms as we created and stood up, revised, and modified scope of work and certifications, to, again, just to associate them with the 1004 Form 70 format, understanding, again, that there are instances where there's likely going to be inspection, you're going to be unable to complete a typical assignment, and we're allowing the desktop and exterior only flexibilities. And if I understood the second part there, no, none of this is to by any way collide with any of the existing desktop forms that are in the marketplace.
That's helpful, Scott. And maybe this next question too is of the same ilk. It is from KC Jesse. The Fannie Mae LL 2020-04 is largely of little help as a desktop. Is only available for purchase transaction with 15% equity. No help for second home, HELOC, refis, etc. Is this a correct interpretation?
I believe so. Back to Bill had inset that slide. You can go back to that in this deck, the permissible appraisal type, appraisal requirements per the mortgage transaction and what we will accept. So yes, so the flexibility for purchase transaction includes the desktop and exterior only, and it gets more limited in the refinance space because there's more risk. And again, the other thing I would just say at a general sense is this is a first step and a first stab for us. So you can appreciate all being appraisers. I think there were a handful of us on my team and on our valuation team inside of Freddie Mac. When we got on these joint calls, we kind of already had it sort of half baked in our mind, right? Okay, we know what we think we can do. We know what things make sense, and we'd be in and out. And by the time we had a lot of hands in the stew and a lot of other points of view that were brought to the table, it was much more involved. So this is the landing place now. And again, we're trying to work with the industry and particularly work with you real time to keep, again, first and foremost, the health concerns and the health crisis in the forefront of our mind and what we can do from a safety perspective and begin to introduce these flexibilities. And I guess that's a long way to say that it's, we're not closing the door to anything we may learn in this less than 60-day period, that we're going to at least introduce this. And, the director's office, FHFA, our regulator, and all of our leadership is behind trying to ensure that we're capturing and sourcing the right valuation product to associate, so we understand the risk, and again, try to meet that with the health and safety of the appraisers.
Okay, Scott, thank you. I think let's do maybe two more questions, but I would like to kind of piggyback on Scott and how the agencies are looking at. So I think from the Appraisal Institute's perspective, this is a webinar that we've put together here on fairly short notice to try to bring some clarity on some of these issues. And events are going to change. And as they change, we will be updating and providing more information, whether it's our normal written process or we have another webinar. We will be doing what's necessary to help our members and help the profession. So I just want to say that. Let me go to this next question from Terry Jensen. How will independent contractors be impacted by packages? I'm going to go to Bill on that because I'm not quite sure what she means by packages. Maybe it's legislative. Do you know, Bill?
Package it, I'm not sure there either. I'm going to try to assume maybe the legislative package, but there's nothing in legislation dealing with independent contractors as far as I'm aware. I have to review the full text though.
Let me just ask Scott if he has an inkling about that, packages.
Packages?
She's on her way back. I guess
Okay.
they're kicking everybody.
I don't know that I'm
answer.
following. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Right. No, that's okay. So it could be possibly that this appraiser is a California resident. Bill, relative to that new law that was passed recently about employees and independent contractors.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that's what that's relating to. But again, there's nothing that's changed as far as the independent contractor law or any of the history or a decision around that issue. Any of the events over the last 2 weeks.
Okay, great, Bill. Let's see here. Whoops, I just lost my questions in the question bar. So maybe that was Providence, that it's time to end the discussion for today. I would like to thank Bill and Doug for their participation, certainly Stephanie and Jim for helping us use Expert Wise and Scott Reuter for coming in at the last minute to help us with GSE stuff. Very, very much appreciated. Again, before we close, I'd like to remind everyone that this webinar will have been recorded, will be available on our webpage on the coronavirus site. I thanked everybody here, so I got that done. In closing, I'd just like to say that I have tremendous faith in the American people, and as I know you do too, and our ability to take a punch or two and still win the day. So together we will triumph over this crazy invisible enemy. Godspeed to all of you, and thank you very much for attending. Thank you.
Thanks for your leadership.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.